It's yet another beautiful morning, afternoon, evening, depending on what time you are watching us. This is your host, Noah Ndlovu, broadcasting live here from our studio in the USA. And today we are privileged once again to be joined by one of Zambia's great historian. This is Professor Bizek Jub Phiri, who is a historian who is written a number of books, articles on the history of Zambia. One of the books that stands out is the political history of Zambia and many others. We are privileged to have this conversation to reflect and talk about what has been happening in South Africa. And we wanted to take a different approach by having a person who is coming from academia to share some thoughts, because there are a lot of people who are talking about these matters happening in South Africa. And I personally been part of some panel conversation and discussions where we have a lot of other countries talking about, no, my country contributed more, my country contributed more, and all that stuff. Then I thought, maybe why don't we invite a historian, a person who has been part of the history, to be able to share from a historical and academic perspective. Hence why we have Professor Phiri here. So Professor Phiri is a distinguished professor from the University of Zambia in Lusaka, and I'm happy that he is joining us today. So greetings, Professor. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending on where people are, as you rightly said. And thank you very much for inviting me on the program.
Yes, yes, yes. So we wanted to for you to sort of walk us through the timeline to discuss or paint a clear picture, especially when it comes to the contribution of Zambia. So I know a lot of African countries contributed to the liberation of South Africa and other Southern African countries, because you're looking at Zimbabwe, Angola, Mozambique, and others. But today we are focusing primarily on Zambia's contribution to South Africa's liberation struggle of movement. So the first question that I have for you, I think before we even uh, get the ball on the road, so talk a little bit about your background, Professor, so that at least people can have a good understanding of where you are coming from and the authority you have to share your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you very much for inviting me to comment and say something about my background. I'm a professor of history at the University of Zambia. I started teaching at the University of Zambia in 1983. So I've been a lecturer and a professor for the past 42 years teaching at the University of Zambia. But with respect to the discussion that we are having this evening, my master's dissertation was on South Africa. I was looking at the conflict between the white English and Afrikaners, the conflict that they had, which led to the Anglo-Boer War. And then looking at the struggle for independence by the Africans themselves, fighting to liberate themselves. So I have been a keen person that has been looking at the history of South Africa from that early age up to the time when South Africa attained independence, and how the various groups of people worked together to fight. Now, when you look at South Africa, you had the extremists on both sides, the Africans and the white communities, but also you had a liberal group. These liberals constituted of both whites and Africans who are saying we need to work together. This is one country for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And that process is what contributed to peace along the way. But however, there were still these extremists that we see coming up from time to time in South Africa. So I can say from my background, I have been a keen observer and writer and researcher on South African history.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Professor, because it's always good to paint a clear picture. So for those who are watching, it's usually like, who is this person talking? So I think with your background, it paints a clear picture so that at least people know that you have done your homework when it comes to this conversation. Now, before we get going, I just want to encourage people. So you want to share the stream, you want to invite your friends, your colleagues, so that at least they can follow along this important conversation. We are decoding, or we are looking at the contribution of Zambia when it comes to the liberation struggle of South Africa. And we are very well aware that the African National Congress, the ANC, has been in power for some time, and then now there are a lot of happenings in the country. So it becomes easy to point to foreigners that, hey, these people are taking our jobs and this and that. But before we get to all that, to that point, we're gonna at least try to go back in time to understand exactly how the dynamics and everything was happening. So sit back, relax, share the stream with your friends and circles. We'll be right back in a few seconds with Professor Phiri. Yeah, so we are joined by Professor Phiri, who is a professor at the University of Zambia in Lusaka. So the first question I have for you, sir, is could you begin by explaining Zambia's role in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa under President Kenneth Kaunda?
Thank you very much for that very important question regarding Zambia's role and contribution to the struggle for independence in South Africa under President Kenneth David Kaunda, our first Republican president. Now, one of the things that Zambia decided upon itself becoming independent in October 1964, together with other African countries in the region, particularly Tanzania and Botswana, they decided that the independence that they had attained was incomplete without the other countries in the region attaining their independence. So President Kaunda, therefore, decided, together with his team, the cabinet, that they are going to ensure that they will support the liberation struggle and the fight against apartheid in South Africa. And in doing so, Zambia accommodated, hosted freedom fighters on the Zambian soil, despite the risks that the country faced. And throughout the struggle against apartheid, Zambia had a lot of challenges, being bombed and so on, but President Kaunda did not give up. And in the process also, President Kaunda educated the Zambians that it was important to accommodate freedom fighters in the country. And in that respect, throughout that period, South African freedom fighters were accommodated and protected, not just by the government, but the Zambian people themselves. And that process ensured that Zambians looked at these freedom fighters who were accommodated as brothers and sisters. And that is the language that President Kaunda used consistently, that these are our brothers and sisters, and therefore we need to support them. And that's how the whole process was supported by not just the government, but the people at large, at all walks of life.
Yeah, it's interesting and it's good the approach that the Kaunda government took to say these are our brothers. I think just like the good book puts it, uh, your brothers and sisters are your neighbors. It's not only those who are biologically coming from the same parents, but that was a good approach to sensitize and educate and inform our brothers and sisters that they are at home. They should feel welcome. In they are amongst their peers. So I think that was the right approach for the government to take. So continuing on our conversation, now the follow-up question to that would be, why did Zambia choose to support liberation movements despite the enormous economic, military, and diplomatic costs that the country was involved in?
One of the reasons why Zambia took that approach, like I've indicated, President Kaunda and his team were very convinced, and they always argued that Zambia cannot talk about freedom when within the region there are countries that are still under colonial rule. They are still like South Africa under apartheid, where the Black Africans were completely discriminated, locked up in these so-called homelands without much freedom. And the President Kaunda said that cannot be allowed to continue. It has to be fought. It has to be removed so that people have the freedom of movement. Because in South Africa under apartheid, Black South Africans could not move from the village to go to town. And Zambia experienced the same process. Remember, in the time before independence, Africans needed passes if you are to leave your village to come to town. So in other words, what President Kaunda was fighting was that what they fought in Zambia and they removed must also be removed in South Africa. The Black South African must be free and free to be wherever they wanted to be, not to be restricted. And they fought very hard that South Africa is one. There are no two South Africans, South African countries. I mean, there's only one South Africa for both the blacks, the whites, even the colors. They belong together and they needed to work together. And that is what motivated President Kaunda and the other leaders that fought with him to ensure that the liberation was successful.
It's always good to have had at the time people like Kenneth Kaunda and the cabinet who thought it wise to extend a hand to the other African countries, because just like in the words of Kwame Nkrumah, the freedom of one is dependent on the freedom of all. It wasn't going to make sense for Zambia to celebrate whilst when you look next, you have your brothers and sisters in bondage. Yeah. So I think that was a wise and noble cause to be your brother's keeper. Now, the follow-up question to that, Professor, is could you share some specific examples of sacrifices Zambia and ordinary Zambians made in support of South Africa's liberation struggle?
Thank you very much for that very, very important question. When you look at Zambia and South Africa at the time of the liberation struggle, militarily, South Africa was very powerful, very strong, a very strong military compared to Zambia. So that was one of the major risks that Zambia put itself against. However, despite that military strength, the Zambian government always looked at it that winning a war is not just about weapons. It's also about the morality of the whole process. The need to convince the people that it is important to work together. And President Kaunda, everywhere he went, when he was speaking at the United Nations General Assembly, when he was speaking at the Organization of African Unity, he always emphasized that the countries in the world must come together and support what Zambia and the other countries in the region are doing to eliminate the domination of the white people, the victimization of the black people by the white government in South Africa. So in other words, yes, South Africa had very strong military weapons. They could have destroyed Zambia. But what made Zambia and President Kaunda especially was the moral conviction that the world should come behind Zambia and support the struggle for independence in South Africa. And it's through that process where we began to see even the United Nations putting up messages and ensuring that South Africa was not allowed to continue that process. So that process was...
apart from the sacrifice of Zambia being bombed, talk a little bit about some of the... are there other examples that you want to add to that one in terms of how Zambia specifically contributed to South Africa?
Well, one of the among the things that Zambia contributed to South Africa was, apart from accommodating the freedom fighters, was that Zambia also, under President Kaunda, ensured that the people that were fighting were accommodated. You recall that a lot of the leaders of the African National Congress were accommodated and protected in Zambia to ensure that there was, for lack of a better term, there was a government in waiting. That once the liberation struggle has gone through, the apartheid regime is out, there should be no vacuum. There should be people that already are prepared to take over.
Ready to
and
take
these
over.
people were led to take over to manage the affairs of South Africa. These people were protected in Zambia. And some of them, people didn't know where they were staying. Because if they were exposed, the South African military would have come and bombed their places and killed them. But they were protected to ensure that they are safe at the time when they were ready to go and manage the affairs of South Africa. And you may recall also that the first president, the first African president when South Africa was liberated, Nelson Mandela, when he was liberated, when he was released from prison, the first place he touched was Zambia, because he also recognized the role that President Kaunda had played in the liberation of South Africa. So he came to meet his brothers. I'm talking about South Africans, South African leaders who were here in Zambia, ready to go and manage the affairs of South Africa upon the defeat of the apartheid regime.
Yeah, that's well said, Professor. So we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back, continuing the conversation with Professor Phiri, talking about Zambia's role in the liberation movement and struggle for South Africa. So stay tuned. We'll be right back. If you're just joining us, we are having a conversation talking to Professor Phiri, who is a distinguished professor at the University of Zambia, who has written a lot of books, among them Political History of Zambia, from colonial rule to the Third Republic, starting from 1890 to 2021. And Professor Phiri has worked on, I think, a recent book, which I ordered the book. It's been purchased, but it has not yet gotten to my end here. So I am patiently waiting to read the book, so at least I can be brought up to speed on the history, because I think history is something that is unique, because most people look at history, it's just memorizing the dates of what happened in the past. It's history serves as a geographical map to locate us in the space of time, because everything that we are, we learned in the past. So we cannot say we forget our history, because we learned how to walk, how to talk in the past. So we always rely on our historical memory to remember what happened in the past to bring us up to where we are. I learned how to talk when I was a baby. So we cannot say, no, that's in the past. No, the past is always present. So I just wanted to make sure people understand exactly what history is about. So continuing the conversation with Professor Phiri. So the follow-up question, similar to the question that I just asked Professor, in terms of the diplomatic front, apart from providing sanctuary, what diplomatic and political role did Zambia play in mobilizing African and international opposition to apartheid?
Thank you very much. In terms of diplomatic and the political role, Zambia did quite a lot. Like I've said earlier, when President Kaunda was in the international arena and at the United Nations, he always spoke very strongly and requested that even the Western countries should not tolerate apartheid in South Africa. And that he made it very, very strong. And also, he made sure that because of the challenge that was there, sanctions needed to be imposed on South Africa in order to ensure that from a diplomatic perspective, Zambia, South Africa was moving towards accommodating and allowing indigenous Black people to be free and manage their affairs. At the same time, like I indicated, Zambia also did not just accommodate freedom refugees, but also facilitate the training of freedom fighters in different places so that they could go and liberate their country. So Zambia, under President Kaunda, took a lot of risks in order to ensure that freedom was attained in South Africa through discussions, diplomatic issues at the international and the United Nations, the African Union, the Organization of African Union then, and also to ensure that those that were fighting, that were prepared, were ready, were supported. So Zambia supported the military struggle because President Kaunda was aware. He was a man who was not a violent man, but he realized that there comes a time when if you are facing a conflict that requires arms, you also have to pick up arms and support those that are fighting. And President Kaunda did that in order to ensure that the freedom fighters of South Africa, the ANC, were supported militarily.
Yes, thank you, Professor. And now moving on, we're gonna shift gears a little bit and talk about the present, because history, about most of the ANC, the struggle, Kenneth Kaunda, liberation, and fast forward, we are here in 2026. Now we have a lot of young people who were born after the liberation struggle. Now the question is, Many young South Africans today were not born, they were born after the apartheid ended. Do you think there is sufficient understanding in South Africa about the sacrifices made by neighboring countries for the freedom that they have today?
I think that is a very, very important question, because the younger generation of today may not know what Zambia did to contribute to the liberation of South Africa. The older generation have a very clear picture. They know the history, they understand and they appreciate. I'll give an example of myself. Many times when I travel from Zambia to South Africa, when I arrive at the airport, as I share my passport, the moment those who know the history of what Zambia did before President Kaunda died, the first question they will ask me to say, how is the old man? Now, if you didn't know who is this old man they are talking about, they were actually talking about President Kaunda. The older generation, those who were there, appreciated very much what President Kaunda did towards the liberation of South Africa. However, with time, you have the younger people now who are in places of life who are not appreciating, who may not know what Zambia did under the leadership of President Kaunda and his government. And because of that, we are beginning to see second conflicts. However, what I can say is that history is very important, as you've rightly pointed out. How much of that history is being circulated and taught in schools in South Africa? When we talk today, we are talking about the transformation that has taken place over time. From the Organization of African Union, we are now have the African Union. From the Organization of African Unity, we now have African Union, AU. We are talking about one Africa. But how can that one Africa be achieved when you have people in different countries, in set generations, who don't appreciate how this unit has come about? So in short, what I'm saying is that there is need in the education system that the history is not forgotten. What contributed to the liberation of South Africa? What made South Africa to be what it is today? Who contributed? Who did what? That is very, very important. That way, we are going to see unity and peace, not just in South Africa, but in the region and at the African continent at large.
Yes, I think it's well put, well said, Professor. Now, in light of what we are seeing now, because 1994, it's 32 years ago, and a lot of people, kids are born, go to high school, finish up by the time they are 18, 20 years, they're in college. They have no understanding of apartheid. They have no idea of what our forefathers did in terms of the freedom that they are enjoying, because they have grown up knowing that, oh, this is the way it is, because they are 20 years, they are 25, they're 30 years, and there's no struggle that they have seen. Now they are looking at the challenges that they are facing. Now, we must also paint a clear picture in terms of the current government in South Africa and the happenings that are happening now, where people are sort of protesting or revolting, demonstrating. The only reason they're demonstrating is because the government has not delivered accordingly, and there is high inflation, unemployment, and young people especially cannot find jobs. Under that backdrop, it becomes very uh, difficult to reflect on the historical context of freedom, what the forefathers contributed, countries like Zambia and the others, because people are hungry. And when people are hungry, they need food right now, they need employment right now. So it becomes very sort of a tricky conversation to point to the past. In your own view, what do you think the government of South Africa, in light of what has happened in the past, how would you rate the ANC in terms of solving the problems for its people?
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very, very important question. How can the ANC government deal with the situation that they have found themselves in? You find now what is happening is that when you look at a foreigner is looked at with a negative perception.
Yeah.
Those that are unemployed are accusing the foreigner that you've taken my job and so on and so forth. They are looking at it from a situation where the government is not explaining. One of the serious negative impact of apartheid was the marginalization of the indigenous Black African in South Africa. That was a major, major challenge of apartheid. The school system in South Africa seriously marginalized the Black people. Now, when the apartheid era ended, when now there was need, the situation opened up. The people that found themselves in South Africa who could do the jobs that previously were strictly retained for white people were not the indigenous South Africans. It became people from other countries who are now the ones that were taking over these jobs. So you want professors in the university, you find that there are very few indigenous South Africans that can get the jobs. You want teachers, you want doctors, and so on and so forth. Now, these are people that are coming from other countries that are trying to assist to educate the people so that but in the interim, the indigenous people are saying these people are taking our jobs. Because one of the things that the apartheid regime did was to deliberately sideline the indigenous people. They would rather have had people coming from other countries, Zambians to go and do the labor, Malawians, and so on and so forth from all over the world. And the indigenous South Africans themselves are being sidelined, locked up in these homelands. Now, that process was supposed to have ended, but the process has not succeeded at the rate at which it should succeed. And this is where now the leadership in South Africa needs to come up with a program of educating their own people that certain things are happening not because these people from other countries are there to undermine, but they are there to assist. But that process is not going to be easy. It is a process that will take a while. But as things are, the leaders are trying to talk. But when people are hungry, it's very difficult to deal with. When people are hungry, it's very difficult to do. So in other words, the educating them, the history, they'll say, well, we have been independent since 1994. Why should these people still be doing the jobs and so on and so forth? But the problem is that it will take time for these things to come to a level where people will be appreciated. But also, what the South Africans need to appreciate is that other countries have accommodated South Africans who have had the desire to go and work elsewhere. They've been accommodated. So it's not a one-way traffic, it's a two-way traffic. So that is something that people need to appreciate. Unfortunately, the majority are still on the ground. Mm-hmm. And those are the ones that are heavily affected, and those are the ones that we see bringing out these challenges. But education and implementation of programs which can help the indigenous people to rise and take charge, that is something that is very, very important. We saw recently the change that was there, that it was not, they were not just targeting the Africans from other countries. Yeah. We saw white people running away to America. But within a few months, the same white people realized that they were better off back home in South Africa. Mm-hmm. So in other words, people need to read carefully on how do we live together and move together and develop our country without looking at another person as an enemy.
Yes, well said, Professor. And I think if I can just add 2 cents on the same, part of my criticism when I look at the challenges, especially in South Africa, is that the education system was not structured accordingly to benefit African people. In that African people, especially in most African countries, the education system needs to be structured in such a way that it teaches the people meaningful skills and education that empowers them. So when you look at the context for South Africa, most of the settlers, they knew that they needed to orient the education in one direction so that at least there are only few skills that the average South African knows. So that by the time everything, for instance, 1994, South Africa gets its independence, you find that there were not so many qualified South Africans for a lot of these positions. Hence, the government had to look outside to fill those positions with people from neighboring countries. So that contributed to having more people coming into South Africa. But fast forward now, the South Africans now are demanding some of these jobs, but you have to look at what type of education do you need, or what type of education do you have for you to say that you can take up this job. So it also goes back to the government to ensuring that the government restructures the education so that at least people have the skills that are needed, so that the government does not necessarily have to look to foreigners to fill most of these positions. So we are doing good on time, Professor, and I think we are almost towards the tail end of our program. So here is a follow-up question, similar or sort of on the same front, but with just a slight difference. Some argue that economic hardship rather than hatred for foreigners is the main driver for recent xenophobic or Afrophobic attacks in South Africa. How would you respond to that?
Thanks very much. That's a very, very important question. I think the xenophobic and Afrophobic attacks that we are seeing are tied very, very strongly, in my view, very, very strongly to the economic disadvantage that the majority of these people are facing. And as you have rightly pointed out, it's related to the education that people have. We are in the 21st century. And in today's world, if you don't have the proper education, you'll be left out in a lot of jobs. Because in most cases now, you'll find that jobs that you would have needed 10 people, maybe you only need 2 because of the way things are working. So because of that, you find that those that have the education have a better opportunity to get these jobs. Now, the education system that was left behind by the apartheid regime, in my view, it has not yet been completely eliminated so that the education now is equal, so that people are properly educated. South Africa has a lot of universities. However, the indigenous people still have challenges to go into these universities. As a result, therefore, you find that most of them are not able to get into proper jobs, which can give them a proper income to manage their affairs and the affairs of the family. So when they see a lot of foreigners working those places, they think, oh, these people are taking my job. But the question and the issue is that the education system needs to catch up, educate the indigenous people to the level of people that are coming from outside. And also, apart from that, the way the world is moving today, you cannot eliminate foreigners. They'll always be part of your economic development. So the question is, the government should come up with proper policies on how to accommodate these foreign workers. In which areas are they needed? Now, another aspect that has been very, very important, which most has not been talked about. The indigenous South Africans themselves are very shy. They shy away from jobs that they think are not for the upper class, to use the term in Zambia, for the people at the top. So you find that now these so-called foreigners are the people that are doing the jobs on the ground. The South Africans saying, I can't do that job. I can't do that job. So because of that, in a sense, they are actually shunning certain jobs that they can do. And the employer has no choice but to employ these foreigners. Now, when this foreigner is employed, they again turn around and say, no, you have taken my job. So it's a matter of changing the mindset. That's another aspect. They need to change their mindset. When you go into an industry, when you go any industry you can go to, people are at different levels. If you don't have enough good education, the kind of job you can get is at the bottom. The person with a better education will get a job above you, and so on and so forth, until at the top. Now, if you did not get a good education, you can be a citizen, but you will not get a top job. So that is one thing that needs to be done, that the South Africans themselves need to be sensitized. They should begin to value education, go to school, so that when they are competing for a job, they can compete for a better job, rather than saying, no, why should I be a person sweeping? And then I'm sweeping in an office where the person who works in that office is a foreigner. That becomes an issue of conflict. But they are not looking at, why is this foreigner at my boss? And me, I'm at the bottom. It's the education. But this is something that is started with the apartheid education. The effects of apartheid education have not been eliminated as much as they should have been. So this is something that needs to be worked on by the South African government, and the people of South Africa need to understand that as well.
Well said, Professor. So as we are cruising down on time, we're going to take our last break, and when we're back, we'll give the final concluding remarks. So if you're just joining us, we are watching a conversation looking at Zambia's contribution to the liberation struggle for South Africa. And we are featuring our guest, Professor Phiri, who is an historian and academician at the University of Zambia. So sit back and we'll be right back after this break. All right. We are now in the final stretch of our conversation. And the last question that I have for you, Professor, is to sort of tie everything together in your own words. What message would you like to send to both South Africans and Africans in light of the recent tension, drawing on the shared history of the continent? Because a lot of people or a lot of countries contributed, sacrificed for the betterment of South Africa. Where do we go from now as a people?
Thank you very much for that very, very important question. Um, One of the things that I can say to both South Africans and other Africans in light of recent tensions that have been going on is that first and foremost, there are certain, one of the things that, let me start from the point that most of the times that I've traveled to South Africa, the people that have invited me, the organization that have invited me, I'm usually invited by South African universities to go and be maybe to do some lectures and so on. One of the things, even before this current situation that South Africa is facing, one of the things that they told me was that, oh, we know you are coming from Zambia where you move freely, but in South Africa you don't do that. So in other words, people need to appreciate, I'm talking about other Africans going to South Africa. You need to be very sensitive, be aware what kind of environment are you moving in. And once you are aware of that, how do you contribute to changing the mindset? Because it's about changing the mindset of the people in South Africa. How can you contribute towards that? So that they don't look at you as a person that is contributing to their problems, but they look at you as a person who is contributing to assisting them to move out of those challenges rather than contributing to their problems. It's not an easy job to do. In order to do that, you need South Africans themselves who will be side by side with you to educate their own people, to say this person or these people are here to assist us to move forward, to improve our environment, not to create problems for us. Don't look at them as people that are the source of your problems, but they are contributing to the solution. That message is very, very important, because if the people on the ground, especially in the leadership, are not sharing this important message, then the conflict will continue. As we noted from the beginning, these issues are associated to economic struggles that the majority of the people on the ground are facing. Because the people at the top don't have the same challenges. It's the people on the ground who have this challenge. Now, you are talking about the economy of South Africa. The economy of South Africa depends on the people on the ground. In fact, not just South Africa. In most economies, is the so-called low-class people who actually make the economy move. Now, if the people that are making the economy move, I'm talking about the people who go underground to mine, if they are finding themselves to be undermined, they'll be angry. So how do you change this process? So the South African government must find ways of resuscitating and building confidence on the indigenous people so that they can accommodate the foreigners who are working side by side with them, rather than looking at them as their enemies.
Yes, Professor. Well said, well said. I think we'll leave it at that. I like the point where you say there has to be, the education has to be also come not only from the South African government itself or the South Africans, but also from the foreigner. I like the point where you mentioned that how can I, as a foreigner in South Africa, help to bridge the gaps so that at least there is no tension so that at least we, people who are foreigners are contributing to sensitizing, to educating, and to informing the South African that these are brothers and sisters and they are there to make life easier, not only for themselves as foreigners, but also for the South Africans in terms of creating jobs and all that good stuff. So I think we'll leave it at that, Professor. Otherwise, I think we still have a little bit of time. What's anything else that you wanted to share? Uh, Anything that you left out, anything that I didn't ask you, anything that comes to mind that you think maybe we need to capture it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I can say is that the education is very important, but also knowledge is very important. Countries like Zambia and other African countries who supported South Africa very, very strongly. For example, after the Soweto uprising, a lot of black people left South Africa and came to Zambia. And Zambia accommodated these people. I remember I was a student at the University of Zambia at the time, and we had a lot of South African students accommodated, working, and also being educated, some of them going to secondary schools and universities. So this is a knowledge that they need to appreciate, that the other countries in the region, in Africa, supported very, very strongly South Africa to be what it is today. So that at the end of the day, we are working as one people. We are one Africa, a united Africa. And they need to do that. For the development of this continent, we need unity, not division.
Well said, sir. You have been listening to Premier Media having a conversation talking about Zambia's role for the liberation of South Africa, and our guest was Professor Phiri, who is a historian, academician at the University of Zambia, who is also an author, has written several books, articles on the history of Africa and the history of Zambia and many other areas in terms of history. So we thank you, Professor, for taking time to be on this program. And we look forward to at least engaging you to help us understand some of these matters, because obviously a lot of people speak from emotions, but we wanted to get some history so that we can paint a clear picture. So thank you, Professor, for joining us on our program.
Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.